What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg. We're looking at Magic, by now. You've been around these parts the last couple of days looking at spoilers, and it just so happens it's exactly what we're doing today. Good thing is, though, I guess, we don't have, like, a million cards to look at today. There's only about 10, 12 cards to peek at, but a lot of them are really good. I've been taking some crap in the comments section because it seems like I don't like cards that you like. Well, it turns out, today, I like pretty much every card we have to look at. There's so much good stuff today, actually, that it's hard to know where to start, so I'll just kind of start in chronological order, starting with the things I missed yesterday. The first thing that we saw late last night was Kiyora's Dam Breaker. This is 6 mana, 5 and a blue for a 5/6 Leviathan. That's an awesome creature type. When Kiyora's Dam Breaker enters the battlefield, you proliferate. Dam Breaker, that's actually a pretty good creature for the limited environment specifically. It's had a pretty good rarity for that environment. And a lot of times, like big blue creatures like this will have some kind of weird drawback involving which players control islands. At least that used to be the case in old school Magic. Haven't seen too many creatures like that recently in blue. Used to be almost part of blue's color pie, especially with creatures with the like Leviathan subtype. There's always some kind of weird drawback, but it turns out this time around it's really, really easy to cast. It's actually a little bit less expensive than you might think. 6 mana actually isn't that much, especially in limited or sealed. And the ability to proliferate is going to help all your planeswalkers, obviously, or any, creatures that you have +1/+1 counters on, which could be a whole army by the time you get this thing down. So in limited, this thing's going to be an absolute, pardon the pun, monster. We also saw Teferi's Time Twist last night. That's a tongue twister, the triple T. 2 mana, 1 and a blue for an instant. Exile target permanent you control. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. If it enters the battlefield as a creature, it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Let's do the Time Twist again and again and again. We actually have multiple cards like this in Standard already, but this one is a little bit better, mostly because of the word permanent in place of the word creature on this card. Being able to blink any permanent is going to be great if you need to, say, reset a planeswalker or a whole bunch of other hijinks you could be getting up to in this format. You can target your opponent's stuff with it, which might be relevant occasionally. There's just a lot of edge play on the card, but unless we see exactly the right deck for it, I'm not sure it's going to actually show up. Oh, but I'm excited about this one, guys. Here's Giant Growth. GG. Easy. Just 1 green mana for an instant. Target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. Return of the Mac. Actually, it's Return of the Mass, I guess you could call it. We haven't seen Giant Growth in Standard in a good long time now, and I'm not sure that it makes all the difference, but it might. Mono-green Stompy decks might want this. Even green decks, or green-red decks might want this. You don't often see a combat trick like this in Standard. Just +3/+3 for 1 mana, and that's all, is really, really good, to the point that it seems Wizards has been almost scared to print this card recently. So, really glad to have GG back in Standard. Super classic card that used to do a lot of work back in the day. And even somewhat recently, just a few years ago, they printed Giant Growth in Standard, and it didn't see too much play then, so I'm fairly sure the card is safe, but it might be a serious role player in green aggro decks. Now, on this Giant Growth here, you may have noticed a couple of new characters. This really cool-looking Planeswalker dude, and big old Pup. And we'll see both of them again here on Jiang Wildcrafter. This is 3 mana, 2 and a green for a 3 loyalty Planeswalker who's actually typed Yanggu, because it follows a naming convention. Each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has tap. Add 1 mana of any color, and you can -1 Yanggu to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So this thing's a bop. Get it right. It just turns all your creatures into birds of paradise, which is great. And it's got really good +1/+1 counter synergy in this format with Fblthp Biomancer, get a loot, just shove a counter onto Incubation Druid, say, on turn 3, which might be really nice. You play Jiang for 3, and then you put a counter on Incubation Druid, and you get another 3 mana right then and there to play Steel Leaf Champion. So that, in and of itself, is pretty serious. You could also put a counter on Growth Chamber Guardian, if you wanted to, on turn 3, and that would be pretty sweet. And then it would be able to tap for mana on subsequent turns, which is pretty sweet as well. So a lot of cool stuff going on here, not to mention the fact that you can target your opponent's creatures in really corner cases, keep them from adapting stuff like Terramander, for instance. So there are a couple of weird things about this card too, but at the end of the day, I'm not 100% sure that it's destined to see play in a top tier deck. But all that said, this will form the basis of very, very many really fun, maybe budgety decks. So I can't wait to get like in the lab with it, get my hands on it, see what we can do with it, because this walker definitely has a lot of potential, and I want it to prove itself on the top tables. That said, I do, again, kind of have my doubts. I have to put this part in here. Devil's Advocate, constructive criticism, whatever you want to call it. But there's a lot of green planeswalkers in this set. I don't know if you guys noticed, but we also, aside from the green planeswalkers like Vivian Reed, who is also a 3-mana walker, this exact same casting cost, and very likely a lot better than this card in some ways. So, not only do you have the Planeswalkers to contend with, but Steel Leaf Champion, Jade Light Ranger, a big one too, and some other important cards depending on, what other colors you might be playing. So, I'm not 100% sure that this is going to do the Jiang thing, but I hope it does. Let's look at that cute little puppy. Again, right here. Oh, he's way bigger on this card. This is Mawu, Loyal Companion, 4 mana, 3 and a green for a 3/3 Legendary Hound. I've always liked that creature type. You got this in a Samaru at this point, but anyway, it's got Trample and Vigilance, and if one or more +1/+1 counters would be put on Mawu Loyal Champion, I was going to say local champion, that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. This is a weird reading, although I'm pretty sure it has to be worded like that, but you have to say +1 a bunch of times in a row. Basically, if it gets 1 +1/+1 counter, it'll end up getting 2. If it gets 4 +1/+1 counters, it'll end up getting 5, so it's just always one more than you think. And really, if you just get like 1 +1/+1 counter on him ever, then he becomes a 5/5 instantly, and he's obviously great on curve after his walker. You play Jiang on 3 into Mawu on 4, and you've got a pretty good, you got a soup going, you got a stew brewing. So it doesn't seem so bad, but again, I'm not sure, especially when compared to 4-drops like Nullhide Ferox and even Vinemare, that this is exactly where you want to be, even given the keyword abilities. But, again, if you can find ways to consistently put, a lot of +1/+1 counters on them and effectively double, the number of counters you get, then I can see this guy being, a 7/7 or a 9/9 fairly quickly. And it even works well with stuff like, Stony Silence. Just 1 green mana for a +1/+1 counter, well, turns it into, 2, and that makes that card way better. Things like Hadana's Climb, this could work with really well. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on with this, and it can even help you win faster off of like Simic Ascendancy. So I'm not going to count this card out. Let's move on to the stuff from today, starting with Eternal Taskmaster. ET is 2 mana, 1 and a black for a 2/3 zombie. Eternal Taskmaster enters the battlefield tapped, though. That's pretty much the only drawback. When Eternal Taskmaster attacks, you may pay 2 and a black. If you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Okay, so this feels, to me at least, like sort of an upgrade on Isarith, And I know that Isarith brings the creature right into play, and that's good, but Isarith also puts a counter on the creature that doesn't allow you to loop that creature. If it leaves the battlefield for any reason, it gets exiled. And this still allows you to pull off loops and get the same creature or creatures back over and over, if you can get multiple attack step with it. That's one thing that I and many players don't like when evaluating cards, is creatures that you have to wait until you can attack with to get real value out of them, and they don't have haste. Creatures that you have to wait until the next turn to get real value out of. Not a big fan of those, but in this case, I don't mind so much. It's not the worst top deck, even given the fact that it enters the battlefield tapped. Still not bad, and given the fact, too, that you can loop a couple of copies of these. If you got one out and it gets to attack step, you can just get another one back from your graveyard and, again, effectively just loop the 2 of them. Plus, this will give you a mana sink, protect you against flood in certain decks. I just like this a lot, even if it only gets to attack once or twice, especially considering a 2-drop is just way better in all cases than a 3-drop for an effect like this. And late in the game, sometimes all it has to do is get an attack step in, even if it doesn't really do anything in that attack step, and you'll be able to get back a game-impacting card or a game-winning card some of the time. So, love recursive abilities like this, and the fact that it's a zombie doesn't escape me either. We've really got something shaping up with that 4-mana core set Liliana, a decent zombie deck brewing up. You got Death Baron in the format. Things are happening, so keep an eye on this creature type as well. And finally, I just should say, he's got pretty decent stats for its mana cost, too. So, you got that going for you. 2 mana for a 2/3 isn't the absolute best stat line in the world, but it's fairly likely that you can get an attack step with this on turn 3 and it survives, you know? So if you do attack with it on turn 3, it's just going to get like a one drop back from the graveyard, which I'm not sure how good that is. Maybe you get a Gutter Bones back, you know? But either way, you know, starting on like turn 5 or 6, this becomes a serious threat when it does attack in. Again, even if you expect it to get blocked and die, still going to create value for you. But up next, familiar face, everybody. Here's Neheb, for some reason. I thought he was dead and gone and all that, but here's Neheb. He's the Dreadhorde champion. He's in the slideshow. 4 mana, 2 red for a 5/4 legendary zombie minotaur warrior. Those are actually all relevant creature types. And it's got trample, which is extremely relevant after you read the ability. Whenever Neheb, Dreadhorde champion, deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you may discard any number of cards. If you do, draw that many cards and add that much red mana to your mana pool. Till end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. Slim Neheb, looking pretty decent for the most part. You know, it turns out the death takes 1 off your converted mana cost. Slims you down just a little bit, tones you up, and actually, I think this might have just a sliver of a chance. I didn't like it when I first saw it, but I've been thinking about this card a lot today. I tend to think about cards that I think are bad more than I think about cards I think are good. Well, something you need to know about me. If I think a card is bad, I like to look at it from a bunch of different angles and stuff. And Neheb was definitely a card I've been thinking about for a good portion of the day. I like a few things about this. I've already mentioned how much I like the trample, for instance. You know, this is, let's put it this way. A second ago I said that I'm not a big fan of cards you usually have to wait to attack with before they get value, especially if they don't have haste. And this is one of those cards, but this is also one of those instances where I think it might be worth it. So let me go through the pros and cons. Now, pro, even though you do have to wait a turn to attack with it, it's got at least a decent body for the mana cost. 5/4 ain't half bad, especially for just 4 mana. So while it's waiting to attack, you've got a pretty imposing blocker at the very least. But con, he dies to Lava Coil. I mean, Rekindling Phoenix does too at this slot, but that's also another con. Given that if you don't have a whole lot of slots for 4 drops in your mono red deck, Rekindling Phoenix is going to be the one that you play every time over a card like this. I mean, if it had just like 1 more point of toughness, we'd really be in business. And the card would be that, like, way, way better if it just had 5 toughness, you know. Or even if you switch the stat line to 4/5 instead of 5/4, I think that would make a huge difference on this card. But it doesn't have 5 toughness. We have to take it as it is. So let's do that and be realistic, you know. Objectively, though, this card does work well with a couple of different strategies. Namely, pump spells, big pro there, considering we just saw Giant Growth, you know. We have Collision Colossus in the format. A card like this might make Colossus actually much, much more playable a lot of the time than it actually is, especially given, again, that Neheb has Trample, which means that you're much more likely, if you do get an attack step in, to actually get some extra cards and some mana out of it. It is a bit of a con here that you have to discard cards. You know, hopefully you have an extra land or 2 in your hand, or maybe a card that's dead at that given moment. You have a Lava Coil, but you're playing against control, for instance. You can cash those in, get fresh cards. Now, if you have pump spells, you'll get even more mana, even more traded in cards, and that's good. But another strategy this actually works really well with is burn. Again, especially because of the trample. Trample is key on this. Trample will make it much more likely that you enable Spectacle. So on your second main phase, after you get this mana, then you'll be able to cast things like Light Up Stage and Skewer the Critics for just 1 mana. And you'll be much more free with what you can do in your mana or with your mana during your first main phase. So in a way, this opens up some really interesting lines for a deck like Burn at the very top of the curve, and it's a formidable threat too that if it gets through a couple of times will really add on to your burn damage and help you finish the game. I'm not totally sure that this is quite where Burn wants to be, but the ability to trade in junk cards for hopefully burn spells and get the mana to cast them and enable Spectacle to get really cheap spells, all of that seems really good to me, so I'd try a couple of copies of this in Burn to see what's up. Now, all of that excites me. All of that, I want to try all of that. I feel like Burn might be the right place for this. But again, I'm not sure how much Burn wants a 4-drop creature outside of Rekindling Phoenix. And that brings me back around to probably the biggest argument against the card. And that's the fact that Rekindling Phoenix exists in the first place. You'd just much rather play Phoenix in the 4-drop slot. If you have extra slots at the 4-drop slot, then maybe, but there's also like Karn, a lot of mono red decks will play Karn for card advantage. But still, there are some other options in the 4-drop slot you might play rather than this, even given that you have extra slots after you add Rekindling Phoenix. But I guess the last thing I'll say about this is that you could totally negate my argument about having to wait for this to swing if you get a third turn Rhythm of the Wild. I feel like this could go really well on curve with Rhythm, so let me add that. A rough translation coming through for you, but we're pretty sure this is exactly right because it's the translation that's on every website. This is Dreadhorde Arcanist, or Arcanist der Schreckens Horde, which is a much better name. It's 2 mana, 1 and a red for a 1/3 zombie wizard with trample. And whenever Dreadhorde Arcanist attacks, you may cast target instant or sorcery card with converted mana cost less than or equal to Dreadhorde Arcanist power from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that card would be put into your graveyard this turn, exile it instead. Okay, so this card's ridiculous. It is, I know I just said that cards you have to wait to attack with aren't usually as good, but this is another one of those cases where it is very much worth it, even if it's just still 1 power. Obviously, if you increase this thing's power, it gets ridiculous. And again, Giant Growth is in the format. I should point that out. Giant Growth goes really, really well with this card. Even if you just, cast Giant Growth on it, and then attack, and then recast Giant Growth. That ain't bad at all on, turn 3. You're attacking for a lot in that case. 7, to be exact. So that's crazy. It doesn't have to get through for combat damage or anything. It just simply has to attack. And even if it's at 1 power, in Standard, you're getting stuff like Shock and Opt back, which is good, plus things like Maximize Velocity and Maximize Altitude, which could actually help you get through with this. All of that seems really good. And obviously, Velocity and Altitude, give it a +1/+1 as well, so you can cast even better cards out of your graveyard, out of your graveyard. So in Modern, you get Faithless Looting. It seems pretty good too. So this is really awesome. This is yet another creature that's good for burn in most formats, although I'm not sure that the power level's quite there in Modern. It very well may be in Standard. Watch out for this thing. You thought I was done? That had an air of finality to it. I'm actually not done quite yet with this card, because check out the creature types. Both relevant. Zombie, sweet that we're getting red zombies. Keep doing that, Wizards. And it's also a wizard. That's great. I have to remind myself to translate that part. It's a zombie wizard. And that means you can cast Wizard's Lightning for just 1 mana on turn 3 after you get this down. Note, by the way, to clear this up, you can't cast a Wizard's Lightning for 1 out of the graveyard. You still have to cast it for 3. Or this thing has to have 3 power when it attacks. Let me put it that way. But you can, starting on turn 3, if you get this on 2, cast Wizard's Lightning for 1. And that actually makes a huge difference too. So really like a lot about this card, and I think it's got the legs to make Standard play. But while we're looking at red cards, let's keep looking at red cards. That seems cool. Here's Grim Initiate right here. Just 1 red mana for a 1/1 zombie warrior. Again, both relevant creature types. And it's got First Strike. And when it dies, you amass 1. I'm actually really excited for this card. Let me tell you why. Just bear with me. Give it a chance. I think that maybe we might be able to take the white out of Mardu Aristocrats, in part because of this card. You might not want to. You might still want to play Mardu with Hero Precinct 1, Hunted Witness. There are a bunch of cards like Teysa, for instance, in Mardu that would aid this strategy, not to mention Afterlife creatures in the first place. But I think that you can really hone things in here and just make things red-black, in part because of cards like this, but also the next card I'm going to show you. We'll get there. But bear with me. With this, you can make the deck red-black, and you can get both Footlight Fiend and this on turn 1. Not to mention Fanatical Firebrand, if that's what you wanted. And you can get that really, really consistently. You'll almost always, be able to cast, a red creature on turn 1 if you tune the mana base correctly. But in a deck that wants to play, both this and Hunted Witness and Gutter Bones, it's a lot harder. So you can still stay super low to the ground in that deck. Get a bunch of early damage in, 1 drop on 1, 2 1-drops on 2, drop a Judith on 3, and you are very much in business, and this card's a part of that. It's basically your red Hunted Witness or Doomed Traveler. That's going to be really good for the Aristocrats deck, whether you're attacking or blocking with it, or you're sacrificing it for value. This thing's really good either way. But here's that other creature I promised you. Here's Dreadhorde Butcher right here. That's an awesome name. 2 mana, a black and a red for a 1/1 zombie warrior with haste. And whenever Dreadhorde Butcher deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, put a +1/+1 counter on Dreadhorde Butcher. And when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. Now, this thing is pushed. This is very pushed, in my estimation at least. There's a bunch of abilities on this card, but a 2 mana 1/1 haste might not look like the absolute best deal in the world, but compare it to Slith Firewalker from ages ago, and this is almost a strict upgrade given that you're in a Rakdos deck that can cast it relatively easily. If you go, say, Fanatical Firebrand on 1 into this on turn 2, then you're attacking for 2 damage on turn 2. You're getting a counter on this, you know. And then, if it ever dies, your opponent's going to take at least 2 damage. And it works really well, obviously, with an Aristocrat strategy, just like the last card. If you can sacrifice this after it gets a couple of counters on it, suddenly you're bolting your opponent to the face, or you're killing a creature. Note this deals damage to any target. So you can bust up a planeswalker by sacrificing this if it's big enough. All of that is awesome. If it gets to like 3 or 4/4, you can just run it into combat and dare your opponent to kill it. Like, even if they double block it, they may end up losing both guys that blocked it and a third guy that you can shoot down after it dies. There's just so much this can do for you if you get a couple of counters on it. Plus, do note that it works really well with things like Judith. I already mentioned that card, but Judith obviously increases its power. Even if it never got a +1/+1 counter on it, when it dies, if you have a Judith out, you'll deal like 3 damage. Right? Because you'll get the ping from Judith in the first place, and then you'll get 2 damage off of this thing dying. So that just really adds up quickly. And like, alongside something like Fireblade Artist, for instance, you know, if you have, say, a Judith and a Fireblade out, then suddenly you can just hit for 4 during your upkeep. You know, sacrifice this to a Fireblade Artist. Actually, it's 5. Sacrifice this to a Fireblade Artist. You'll get 2 damage from the Fireblade Artist, 2 damage from the 2-power, you know, this thing, the Butcher. And then you'll get a ping off of the Judith as well. So you're just doing all the damage in the world. That's going to lead to crazy reach. And I think a card like this, even though it looks understated on its face, is going to do so much for that Rakdos aggro deck. And I do think that it goes in. It's worth the slots to me. But in case you needed another card to get excited over, here's Gleaming Overseer. This thing's busted, you guys. It's 3 mana, 1 a blue and a black for a 1/4 zombie wizard. There's that creature type again, both relevant. And when Gleaming Overseer enters the battlefield, amass 1. Zombie tokens you control have hexproof and menace. Whew, that's 2/5 worth of stats on 2 creatures for just 3 mana, which, just pause for a second, that is already very good. If the card did literally nothing else, then, you know, if you have no other army out when you do cast this, 2 bodies, 2/5 worth of stats. One of the bodies, by the way, has hexproof and menace. It's so much value in and of itself, but it turns out all your zombie token bodies have hexproof and menace. So you can either have a small army of little zombie tokens. I was going to say goblin. Little zombie tokens that all have hexproof and menace, force a sweeper on the opponent, whatever. Or you could amass 1 giant, tall army, you know, 1 big army creature. It's like a 5/5 hexproof menace, and then you might have the game sewed up in that case too. So there's a lot of lines on this, not to mention the fact it goes really well with, like, you know, both Lilianas. The 4 mana one and the 6 mana one both make zombie creature tokens. So yeah, you guys, 3 mana is really, that is super pushed. And it looks like, even though I'm not sure this card sees all the competitive play, it is going to be a force in budget decks at the very least. But for all we know, this might help, you know, blue-black zombies just bust through, or maybe even Grixis zombies bust through to, like, real competitive standard play, because there's so much value on this card. Even if you have literally, like, no other zombies and you're not even in a zombie deck, like, blue-black mid-range might want a card like this. Despite other 3-drops like Thief of Sanity it could play, this is just a board in a box, you know, a hexproof creature on top of that you can make bigger as the game goes on, depending on what other amass stuff you have. Like, yeah, this looks actually really, like, deceptively good. But up next, we got to see Totally Lost. And check out Fblthp. There he is. You guys knew we'd see him somewhere in this set. And isn't he in a sticky situation up on top of Ugin's head? He's a cute buddy. But what? Wait, we actually got like a Fblthp card? Well, yeah, there he is. Oh, well, he's gone. Hopefully he'll come back long enough for us to cover. There he is. Okay, let's pin him down while we got him here. Here's Fblthp the Lost, who finally gets his own card. Just an enduring and endearing figure in Magic history. Fblthp appears in a lot of art with really no ceremony. He just pops up sometimes. But the legend is finally made real. He's just 2 mana, 1 in a blue for a 1/1. There he goes. Okay, he's back. He's a legendary homunculus. And when Fblthp the Lost enters the battlefield, you draw a card. If it entered from your library or was cast from your library, draw 2 cards instead. When Fblthp becomes the target of a spell, shuffle Fblthp into its owner's library. I've got a homunculus for this card, man. This is just a better, in most ways, Elvish Visionary or Dusk Legion Zealot, and those cards see play. Mostly, you know, in Vampire and Elf decks, respectively, because of their creature types. Big, giant boon for certain decks that want those creature types. But even Aristocrats play Dusk Legion Zealot, and certain decks will play Elvish Visionary that aren't Elf decks. Anyway, kind of obscuring the point here. Basically, a 2-mana creature that draws you a card when it enters the battlefield is good. That's good, period, no matter what the stat line is, as we've seen throughout Magic history. And I don't mind losing a relevant creature type to still get that ability. Just the fact that it draws you a card upon entering the battlefield is great when you just cast it for 2 mana. You get a blocker, and you get a card. It automatically replaces itself as soon as you play it. All of that's sweet. If that's all the card did, I might actually consider playing it, especially given the legendary status. You guys knew I was going to get to this at some point, but I have to say it. I know you guys hate Mox Amber, but this is yet another just 2-mana legend that enables Mox Amber, and the more of those that we have, the better, and the better Mox Amber gets. So I should at least point that out. But what everyone's mostly freaking out about here is, the fact that if you play it basically from your library, you get to draw 2 cards. And there are tons and tons of ways to do that. Probably the most common way people are mentioning today is Proteus Staff, which is mostly a commander combo, and a pretty sick one at that, because it's going to lead to just tutoring cards. Basically, whatever card you want in your deck, you'll be able to find at some point. There's also Collected Company in Modern. I'm not sure the card is good enough for that, but it very well may be. I could eat those words any day. But it's also Bolas' Citadel, the legendary artifact for 6 mana that we just saw the other day. You can play this for just 2 life, and end up drawing 2 cards and getting a body on the battlefield, which is really, really, really good value. This also works kind of well with Experimental Frenzy, although it kind of feels non-bowish, because you draw the 2 cards and you can't cast them. But there is Experimental Frenzy. If you play it off the top of a Frenzy, then yeah, you get 2 cards in your hand for that. So a lot of cool stuff going on as far as that's concerned. There's Vivian's Arcbow. We just saw that like yesterday. That'll let you get this from your library, put it, slap onto the battlefield, draw 2 cards off Arcbow. Actually get card advantage. You have to discard a card to activate Arcbow. But play this, you get 2 cards off of it. You get more Arcbow activations if that's what you want, or just big stuff to play. So that's crazy. There's also Vannifar. You could always, in the mid or late game, just trade in a lot of Elves with a Vannifar, and then spin up to get a Fblthp and draw 2 cards off that Vannifar activation, which feels like playing Pod and Standard. There's even more that you can do with this. It just would take all night to list all of the things. Obviously Birthing Pod is fair game as well, if Vannifar is, so there's that. But there's tons of ways to make this thing work, and I haven't even talked about the fact that if it gets targeted with a spell specifically, not an ability, but a spell or whatever, then it just goes straight back into your library, and it's possible that you'll find it again, especially if the whole game, the game you're playing at least, is that you're just trying to play this over and over, target it with your own spells, put it back in your library, find it again, blah, blah, do tricksy stuff like that, Vannifar it back into play after you target it with your own spell. So all of that is sweet, but if your opponent ever does target it, you're not going to lose it. You might not ever draw it again that game, but then again, you might. So, it's always going to be, especially late in the game, it's never a bad top deck, because you'll always get another card and you don't mind paying 2 mana and getting a body for your trouble. So I just love everything about Fblthp. This is a nearly perfectly designed card, and it's innocuously very, very good. Now, there is a card, actually there are multiple cards right now that some people have been asking me about. Why haven't I covered them yet? There's one big one in particular. And I haven't covered them yet because they're not officially spoiled yet. Sometimes I will cover leaks, but Wizards is trying something different this time, this spoiler season. And basically what they're doing is nearly every card in the set has been assigned to some content creator or another. Not all, but very many. And things are being spoiled in a very specific order so as to tell the story of War of the Spark. So when cards get leaked out of order, it screws that story order up and really kind of throws a huge wrench in what Wizards is trying to do. And that's not even the worst part to me. The worst part is that with so many content creators being assigned cards this season, if you cover the leaks, then it's very likely that you're taking away the chance at an exclusive preview from another content creator. And as someone who does this, it feels... It's really important, when you first get an exclusive preview, it's a really big deal. And I don't want to take that away from any content creators. So I'm not covering the leaks this time around. I'll cover cards as they become spoiled. And there's a couple of big ones that I know you want to hear me talk about, but we'll get around to them when we get around to them. There's been plenty of content creators that have already talked about these, and many of them are quite good. You don't need me to tell you that, but I'll give you my take on them when it's time for that. When they're officially spoiled, I'll do it. But until then, I don't want to take away another content creator's chance to spoil their card. And with that, we're actually done. We cleaned this one up pretty quick, you guys. That wasn't a bad one. We didn't have 40 cards to cover. But like I said, I didn't have a bunch of crap to dump on these cards and be like, planeswalkers are bad. Like, that wasn't today's video. Actually, I really, really liked a lot of these cards, and I think they have potential in multiple formats. Let me know what you actually liked from today, or maybe my takes were way off, and you think that a couple of these cards are just absolute trash. You know, I think Neheb and the 2-mana red wizard that lets you like recast spells when it attacks, I think those are on the verge, but there's so many pro arguments for them, you know, arguments in their favor, that I think they at least have a chance, especially that 2-mana zombie wizard. That thing's going places, man. But let me know if you think I'm totally off base down there in the comments section. I want to hear your takes now. Aside from that, do all the YouTube stuff you know to do. We're all adults here. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't done it yet for more spoilers, hit the bell for the notification. Do the things. Support me on Patreon if you absolutely can. All I ask is $1 a month, and you'll get to vote on what decks come up first in Deck Tech season. So that's pretty good distinguishing honor. I don't know. Just throw me $1 if you've got $1 in your pocket once a month. I can really use it over here. It keeps the channel alive because AdSense is awful lately. So help me out if you possibly can. Aside from that, go over to TCG Player. They also help keep the lights on around here. Just that little bit helps, you know. But they're also, where are you going to get these cards for the lowest? On pre-order. Plus, sealed product right now is at a little bit under typical MSRP. I know Wizard says MSRP doesn't exist anymore, but still, the prices are under $100 for sealed product on pre-order now. Sealed boxes of the set. So if you want to pre-order boxes, you know, an all Planeswalker set seems like a pretty cool thing to you, just hit the link in the description, go over to TCG Player, or if you just want to look at any of the prices of these cards for pre-order as they are yet so far in the season, it's kind of a cool little price guide. We don't have Inquest anymore, so if you want a price guide, TCG Player is a good place to do that. Hit the link in the description. Aside from that, pretty much done for this one. Didn't have any cats this video. I think they're asleep in the next room on the cat tree. So I'm sorry about that, but there were some really good cards. At least you got that, you know. But just let me know how you felt about them, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from the Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.